Every single person in that clinic went rigid. They knew who he was, the chairman. They knew what happened to those who displeased him, and the woman bleeding in his arms was his fiancée. So nobody moved. Except her. Kaya Smith didn't flinch. The trauma nurse from Johannesburg didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward the most powerful man in the city, looked past him as if he were merely part of the furniture, and got to work on his fiancé's face. He had never been so thoroughly ignored in his entire life. What happened after that? The secret she would uncover about her own past, what it cost him to pursue a woman who wasn't his, the empire he would have to burn down just to have a chance with her. Nobody in that room could have possibly predicted it, including Kaya. Especially Kaya. If this story already has your heart racing, subscribe now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This is about to get so much more complicated before it gets simple, and I would love to say hello and see how far our story is traveling. The automatic doors hissed open, and the air in the trauma unit didn't just cool, it died. A receptionist froze mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over a keyboard that suddenly felt like a liability. Two doctors in the hallway pulled themselves against the white-tiled wall, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor, praying to be invisible. They knew the silhouette filling the frame. They knew the tailored charcoal suit and the broad frame that moved through the room like a blade. Jikhan didn't look for trouble. He simply carried the aftermath of it in his arms. He held Tanshi against his chest, her black blazer soaked through with a dark, rhythmic stain that dripped onto the polished floor. A jagged wound had split her cheek from bone to jaw, a visceral mark of betrayal that had silenced the entire wing. Under the hum of the overhead lights, the fear was thick enough to choke on. Kaya Smith came around the corner carrying a trauma tray, her dark blue scrubs a sharp contrast to the pale, terrified faces of her colleagues. Her natural hair was pinned back in a precise, professional bun, and her white-gloved hands were steady. She didn't see a kingpin who owned the city's docks and its politicians. She saw a deep laceration and a patient in shock. She stepped past her frozen coworkers without a glance and moved toward Jikhan. She didn't stop until she was inches from him, looking through his looming presence as if he were nothing more than furniture in the way of her work. "I need to sit her down right now," Kaya said, her voice a calm, low anchor in the chaos. Jikhan felt his jaw tighten. For 11 years, he had been the sun that every room orbited around. People shook in his presence or scrambled to clear his path. Yet this woman didn't even register the danger he represented. He watched her as she positioned Tanshi under the surgical light, her movements unhurried and methodical. Kaya leaned in, her focus absolute as she pressed gauze to the wound. She began to speak not to him, but to the girl, asking about her favorite view and what she liked to eat, her voice keeping the patient's mind somewhere softer while her hands did the difficult work. Jikhan stood in the corner, arms folded, watching her operate. He had seen soldiers hold themselves together and negotiators dismantle men, but he had never seen anyone work with this kind of terrifying, selfless commitment. As a strand of her hair escaped its pin, falling across her focused face, he reached out without thinking to brush it back. Kaya went still, not with the paralysis of fear, but with the curiosity of a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She looked at him for 2 full seconds, her gaze completely unbothered, before turning back to the wound. In that moment, the most powerful man in Seoul felt something fracture. He was disarmed, not by a blade, but by the absolute refusal of a nurse from Johannesburg to acknowledge his throne. The weeks that followed the clinic incident didn't bring the storm the other nurses had predicted. There were no black-suited men demanding silence and no threats delivered in low voices. Instead, there was a ghost. Jikhan began to appear at the edges of Kaya's world, a silent sentinel waiting where the city's neon glare faded into the shadows of the hospital's rear exit. He didn't arrive with the armored motorcade that usually signaled his movement through Seoul. There was only a single, unassuming black sedan parked near the bus stop, its engine humming a low, patient vibration in the midnight air. The first time he approached her, he wasn't carrying a weapon or a demand. He held a simple paper bag, the scent of roasted nuts and warm spices cutting through the sterile smell of antiseptic that clung to her scrubs. Inside was ground nut soup, thick, savory, and exactly how she had described it during a fleeting moment of exhaustion in the trauma bay. He didn't ask how he had found the specific recipe or the small shop that made it. He simply handed it to her, his eyes locked on hers with a gravity that made the streetlights seem dim. They began to find their way to a weathered park bench on a hill overlooking the Han River, a place where the wind was clean and the noise of the empire below felt like someone else's problem. It was the kind of quiet that only busy people find in high places, the silence of two people who spent their days navigating different types of wreckage. Jikan sat with his back straight, his expensive coat unbuttoned, looking out at the water. He didn't talk about the docks or the men who bowed when he walked past. He asked about Johannesburg. He asked about the specific shade of the sky before a storm in the Highveld and the sound of the streets where she grew up. In return, Kaya didn't ask about the blood on his cuffs or the names whispered in fear at the nurse's station. She spoke to the man who remembered she liked her soup spicy and her coffee black. On that bench, the chairman of the most dangerous organization in the country was just a man with tired eyes, and the nurse who had treated his fiancée was just a woman looking for home. Jikan watched her as she talked, his intense gaze softening in a way that would have terrified his lieutenants. He was learning her cadence, the way her hands moved when she was passionate, and the steady, rhythmic beat of a life that didn't require his permission to exist. They were building a fragile, secret bubble, unaware that the world they were leaving behind was already preparing to burst it. The fragile peace of the park bench did not follow Jikan back into the gilded cage of his headquarters. The air inside the penthouse office was different, heavy with the scent of expensive floor wax and the lingering chill of unspoken threats. He sat behind his desk, the Miller file open before him, but his mind was elsewhere, anchored to the sound of Kaya's laugh against the Seoul skyline. The contrast made the ledger in front of him look like a list of sins. For years, he had accepted this world as a necessity, a machine that required blood to stay greased. But now, seeing it through the lens of a woman who healed for a living, the machine just looked broken. The door opened and Jo-san stepped in. His right-hand man, the one who had stood by his father's side and then his own, moved with a practiced, predatory grace. He laid a digital tablet on the desk, his expression a mask of stony loyalty. "The investigation into the attack on Tanshi is complete, Chairman," Jo-san said, his voice as smooth as Riverstone. "We've traced the logistics. It was a rival faction from the docks. I've already authorized the retaliation." Jikan didn't look at the tablet. He looked at Jo-san's hands, the hands that had supposedly been searching for the truth. "The docks, Jo-san, or the warehouse you visit every Tuesday that isn't on our books?" The silence that followed was a physical weight. Jo-san didn't flinch, but the air in the room shifted. Jikan stood, moving toward the floor-to-ceiling window. "I saw the security footage from the alley, the parts you tried to scrub. The blade that marked Tanshi didn't belong to a rival. It belonged to one of our own. You didn't want to protect the empire, Jo-san. You wanted to harden me. You thought I was getting soft because of a nurse." "I did what was necessary for the legacy," Jo-san finally whispered, his loyalty twisting into something grotesque. "You were distracted. This girl, she is a weakness we cannot afford." "She is the only real thing I have," Jikan countered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Before he could finish, his private line buzzed. A single image appeared on his screen, a long lens photograph of the park bench from the night before. Kaya was smiling, her hand resting near his on the wood. The sender was his mother, Lady Kong. There was no text, just the image, a silent maternal warning that she was watching, that the test had already begun. Jikon realized then that his world wasn't just violent, it was rotten at the root. His mother wasn't just observing his heart, she was measuring it for the blade. He looked back at Jo-san, then at the photo of Kaya, and realized he wasn't just fighting an enemy at the gates. He was living in a house of ghosts, and the only way to save the light was to let the house burn. The fluorescent lights of the hospital cafeteria always felt too bright after a double shift, stripping the world of its soft edges. Kaya sat alone, a cold cup of coffee between her hands, when a man in a tan trench coat slid into the chair opposite her. He didn't move like the men in Jikan's world. There was no heavy silence or sharp suit. He looked like a man who spent his life in archives, tired, unassuming, and wearing a badge that identified him as Detective Robert Miller. "I'm not here to make trouble, Nurse Smith," he said, his voice carrying a practiced, empathetic warmth. "I'm here because I think you're in over your head, and I'm the only one who cares enough to pull you out." Robert didn't lead with threats. He led with a photograph of her father, Emmanuel, taken in Johannesburg years ago. The sight of it made Kaya's breath hitch, a sudden bridge to a past she had tried to bury under layers of trauma protocols and Seoul's high-rises. Robert watched her carefully, his eyes reflecting a fatherly concern that felt like a sanctuary compared to the intense, demanding gaze of a mafia boss. Over the next few days, Robert became a recurring shadow in her peripheral vision. He would meet her near the flower stall or walk with her for a block after her shift, never staying too long, always leaving a small piece of information behind like a breadcrumb. He spoke of cold cases and unfortunate connections, painting a picture of a city where men like Jikan didn't just build empires, they paved them with the lives of people like her father. "He's charming, I know," Robert whispered one evening as they stood near the bus stop. "Men like him have to be. But the suit doesn't cover the history, Kaya. There's a file, a record of a decision made a long time ago in a boardroom in Seoul that ended a life in Johannesburg." He was positioning himself as her shield, the only person willing to tell her the truth while the chairman played at being a gentleman on a park bench. Kaya felt the world splitting. On one side was the man who brought her groundnut soup and remembered the spice level she liked. On the other was the detective offering her the one thing she had always wanted, an explanation for the hole in her heart. Robert watched her struggle, a small, satisfied smile hidden behind the rim of his coffee cup. He wasn't just a detective, he was an architect, and he was building a cage of truth that would eventually snap shut, leaving Kaya with nowhere to run but directly into the heart of the storm he had created. He was waiting for the perfect moment to hand her the file that would turn her sanctuary into a crime scene. The rain in Seoul didn't fall. It hung in the air like a heavy gray curtain, blurring the neon signs of the city into bleeding smears of light. Robert led Kaya to a small, nondescript office in a building that smelled of damp concrete and old secrets. He didn't speak as he slid a thick manila folder across the metal desk. The Miller file was no longer a threat. It was a physical weight, cold and final. "I told you the suit doesn't cover the history," Robert said, his voice dropping the facade of fatherly warmth for a sharp, clinical edge. Page 14, the logistics buyout of the Johannesburg port terminals, 10 years ago. Kaya's fingers trembled as she flipped the pages. Her eyes scanned the technical jargon of maritime law and corporate acquisitions until they snagged on a name: Emmanuel Smith. Her father hadn't died in a random act of street violence, as she had been told. He had been the lead foreman who refused to sign over the terminal to a foreign interest. He had been the obstacle. At the bottom of the authorization that moved a security enforcement team into his district, the same team that had arrived with silenced weapons and no mercy, was a signature. It was bold, elegant, and unmistakable. It was the same handwriting she had seen on the small cards tucked into bouquets of peonies. It was G. Khan. The room felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out. The memory of the park bench, the groundnut soup, and the quiet talks about the Johannesburg sky curdled in her stomach. She wasn't a woman he had found. She was a debt he was trying to pay with silence and spicy broth. When the door opened, G. Khan stepped in, his silhouette cutting through the dim light. He looked at Robert, then at the open file, and finally at Kaya. For the first time, the chairman looked small. The intense, commanding gaze she had first met in the clinic was now hollowed out by a devastating, silent admission. "Kaya," he whispered, stepping forward, "I didn't know who he was to you. Not then. I was a son following a father's ledger. You were a monster," she finished, her voice a steady, terrifying calm that stopped him in his tracks. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, desperate to anchor her to the man he had tried to become. But Kaya didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She did the most compelling thing she had ever done in her life. She looked through him. She rendered him invisible, just as she had that first day in the clinic. She stood up, tucked the photograph of her father into her pocket, and walked past him. She didn't look back as the heavy door clicked shut, leaving the most powerful man in Seoul standing alone in a room that suddenly felt like a tomb. The fire didn't start with a match. It started with a pen. For 48 hours, Ji-Khan didn't sleep. He sat in the center of his glass-walled office, methodically signing away the foundations of the empire that had cost Kaya her father. He transferred the logistics terminals to a public trust, handed the evidence of Joe San's black market operations to the authorities, and liquidated every asset built on the suffering of others. He watched as his lieutenants walked out, their faces pale with the realization that the throne was being dismantled from the inside out. By the second night, the building was empty. The silence was absolute, no longer a heavy threat, but a clean slate. He walked past the portrait of his father, the man whose signature had started the cycle, and didn't look back. He was no longer a chairman. He was a man whose hands were finally, terrifyingly empty. The park bench was damp with the early morning mist when he found her. Kaya was sitting exactly where they had first shared the groundnut soup, her eyes fixed on the gray horizon of the Han River. She didn't look up when he approached, but she didn't walk away. Ji-Khan didn't sit beside her. He stepped into the cold concrete in front of her and sank to his knees. The charcoal suit, worth more than most people earned in a year, meant nothing against the grits of the ground. He didn't offer excuses or a kingdom. He didn't even offer an apology, knowing that words couldn't reach the depth of what had been taken. "It's gone," he said, his voice raw and stripped of its commanding edge. "The ports, the name, the power. I burned it all down so I could stand here as nothing but myself." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white business card. It wasn't embossed with a family crest or a corporate title. It was for a small, legitimate logistics startup, the only thing he had kept, built on clean capital and honest work. "I'm not the man who signed that paper anymore, Kaya, but I'm the man who will spend every day of the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the woman who saw through me." Kaya looked at him then, her gaze searching his face for the monster she had seen in the file. She saw only the man who had stayed in the rain just to be near her light. She didn't reach out immediately. She let the complicated, specific weight of their history sit between them until it was finally light enough to carry. Slowly, she stood up and took his hand, pulling him up from the cold concrete. They walked away from the bench together, leaving the skyline of the empire behind them. As they moved toward the city, the sun began to break through the gray, and Ji-Khan knew that from this day forward, the only red in their lives would be the roses he brought her, not as a debt, but simply because he remembered.